In the spring of 1947, a Navy cameraman boarded a transport aircraft at the edge of the Antarctic ice and flew north with a single canister of 16mm film tucked inside a padded equipment case. He had spent weeks at the bottom of the world with Operation Highjump, the largest naval expedition ever assembled for the southern continent, and the canister in his case was the last of several he had shot during the mission. The others had already been shipped home through official channels. This one, according to the account that survives, he carried personally. He had been told to. He did not know why he specifically had been asked to hand carry it rather than route it with the rest, and he did not ask. In the Navy of 1947, a junior cameraman did not ask why an admiral's aide handed him a canister and said to keep it close. He kept it close. He delivered it. And then, as far as the public record is concerned, the film inside that canister was screened exactly once in a room in Washington that was not open to the press and was never broadcast again. What was on it is the question that has stayed open for nearly 80 years. If you have spent time inside the Highjump story, you already know that the operation produced an enormous quantity of official film. The Navy brought cameramen specifically to document the mission, and the footage they shot was edited into a documentary that was released to the public and screened in theatres in the late 1940s. That film exists. It has been preserved. Researchers have watched it many times. It shows ice, aircraft, ships, men working in cold weather, the machinery of a large military expedition doing what large military expeditions do in official documentation. It is thorough and professional, and, in the way that official military film tends to be, it is also conspicuously incomplete. The researchers who have studied it most carefully note not what it shows but what it does not. For an operation that covered as much territory as Highjump covered, in as many directions with as many aircraft flying as many hours, the public documentary accounts for a surprisingly small portion of what was actually filmed. Hours of expedition footage, logged in the Navy's own internal records as having been shot, do not appear in the released film. Some of that gap is ordinary. Military operations produce more raw footage than any edited release can hold, and the cutting room floor of a 1940s documentary is not a suspicious place. But some of the gap is not ordinary, and the gap around the single canister carried north by a junior cameraman in the spring of 1947 is the least ordinary of all. Before we go further, if you follow the parts of the historical record that were filmed but never shown, subscribe now, because this channel was built to sit in exactly that darkness and ask what was edited out. To understand what the unreleased reel might contain, you have to understand what Highjump actually did in the weeks before it ended. The expedition had 3 operational groups. The central group, built around the icebreaker and the supply ships, established the main base at Little America on the Ross Ice Shelf. The eastern and western groups swept along the Antarctic coastline in opposite directions, conducting aerial surveys and mapping the continent's edge from above. This is the operation as officially described. What the official description does not account for is the flight activity that the Navy's own logs place inland, away from the coastline, in directions that the mapping mission had no stated reason to go. Aircraft were dispatched on headings that pointed toward the interior of the continent, toward the deep geography that was officially unknown and officially uncharted. Some of those flights returned. Their footage, if any was shot, went into the standard channels and presumably into the standard documentary. But at least some of those inland flights were the ones that prompted the early end of the expedition, and the footage associated with them is the footage that is missing. The cameraman who carried the canister north was not one of the lead documentary crew. He was attached to one of the task groups, a secondary assignment, a man whose job was to document flight operations rather than craft a narrative. This distinction matters because it means he was present for things the documentary crew was not sent to cover. He was on the aircraft. He was in the air over the ice when the aircraft were going places the documentary crew had not been briefed to document. Whatever he shot in those final days of the expedition, he shot because he was there, not because anyone had planned for it to be filmed, and when the aide asked him to carry the canister personally, the implication, understood without being stated, was that the contents of that canister were not for the standard editing process. They were for a specific room, a specific audience, and then silence. The screening, according to the account passed down through the researchers who have tracked this thread most carefully, took place in a building near the Navy Department. The audience was small, somewhere between 12 and 20 people, and the people in the room were not journalists or documentary producers. They were officers, analysts, and at least one civilian whose institutional affiliation was not recorded in the secondary sources. Admiral Byrd was present. The film was shown without narration or introduction. The room was quiet during the screening and remained quiet for a period afterward. The man who had carried the canister was not in the room. He had delivered it and been thanked and told he could return to his regular duties. And he did, and he spent the rest of his career with a specific instruction given to him at the door of the building. He was not to describe the contents of the canister to anyone. He was not asked to sign anything. He was simply told by a senior officer that what he had shot was a matter of operational sensitivity, and that operational sensitivity meant silence. He maintained that silence for over 30 years. When he finally spoke, in a conversation documented by a researcher in the early 1980s, he was in his late 60s, and he said two things with clarity. He said the footage was real, meaning it had not been staged or constructed. It was exactly what the camera had seen when he pointed it at what was in front of him. And he said that what was in front of him was not ice, in Antarctica. On a flight that the Navy had sent inland in the final days of an expedition that then abruptly ended, the Tartaria researcher reads those two words and knows immediately what conversation they enter. Because the oldest question at the heart of the Tartaria investigation is not about buildings or maps or demolished train stations. The oldest question is about what the world actually looks like when you go to the places the official story says are empty. The official story of Antarctica is one of the most complete and confident official stories that exists. The continent is frozen. Its interior is a plateau of ancient ice several kilometers deep. Nothing lives there that could be called civilization. The map is fixed, the climate is documented, and the surveys have been done. This is the version of the southern continent that every school teaches and every atlas confirms. But the Tartaria researcher has spent enough time with the older maps to know that this version is not the only version ever drawn. The Piri Reis map, produced in 1513 from source charts the Ottoman admiral said predated his era by centuries, shows a southern landmass with a coastline that does not match the ice coast, but does match the geological coast beneath the ice, which was not measured until the 20th century's sub-ice surveys. The older the source, the more the southern continent looks like land. The newer the official record, the more completely the land disappears beneath a geography that only ice can produce. If Byrd's inland flights found something that the ice model cannot explain, the footage from those flights would be exactly the kind of material that goes into a canister, gets hand-carried by a junior crew member who is told to ask no questions, gets screened once in a quiet room, and then never moves again. This is not a dramatic proposal, it is a logistical description of how sensitive military material is handled, applied to a specific sequence of events that is itself part of the documented record. The canister existed, the hand carry existed, the restricted screening existed. None of this is disputed by the secondary sources. What is disputed is only what the footage showed, and the only person who claimed to know, the cameraman who shot it, said clearly that it was not ice. There is a further detail that connects the film to the wider Highjump story. In the weeks after the expedition returned, a small number of journalists were given managed access to Byrd for interviews. But in at least two of these, Byrd said things that no public affairs officer appears to have caught before they were published. He spoke of the polar regions in terms that went beyond any mapping mission's mandate. He spoke, in one widely quoted passage, of an enemy that could arrive from the poles with enormous speed. In 1947, this was read as Cold War language, a reference to the Soviet Union and the threat of intercontinental aviation. The Cold War reading is reasonable, but it does not fit the words with precision, because Byrd did not say an enemy that could arrive from across the poles. He said from the poles themselves. That is a different geography. Across the poles implies a flight path. From the poles implies an origin. An enemy that originates at the southern pole is not a Soviet bomber. It is something else, and the footage that was never broadcast again is the footage that might have shown what that something else looked like. The documentary that was released, the official Highjump film, ends before the expedition does. A documentary about an 8-week expedition does not end in week 5 unless someone decided that week 6, 7 and 8 were not for public viewing. The released film accounts for the early part of the mission, the departure, the establishment of base, the coastal survey flights, the machinery of the operation functioning as planned. It does not account for the period when things stop functioning as planned. It does not address the early withdrawal. It does not show the inland flights of the final days. And it does not include whatever the junior cameraman was pointing his camera at when a senior aide decided that the resulting footage should travel separately in a padded case and arrive in Washington in a hand that could be told face to face to stay quiet. This is how the edited record looks when you map it. There is an expedition. The expedition produces footage. The footage is released in a documentary. The documentary covers the expected portion of the expedition. The unexpected portion has footage too, footage that was shot, logged, carried north, screened and sealed. The seal has held for nearly 80 years. The Navy has not released the reel. No FOIA request has ever returned a document that acknowledges the restricted screening by name. The cameraman who carried it is dead. The officers who sat in the room and watched it are dead. The aide who pressed the canister into a young man's hands and told him to keep it close is dead. What remains is the account, passed through researchers over decades, specific enough in its details to be either genuine memory or an extraordinarily careful fabrication, and silent enough at its centre that the fabrication would have had to be built around a real absence, a real gap in the official documentary record, a real film that stops before the story does. The Tartaria investigation is, in its deepest form, an investigation into the gap between what was recorded and what was released. It is an investigation into the editing. Every civilization edits its record. The question the Tartaria researcher asks is not whether editing happened, but what was cut. And the principle the investigation operates on is that the most significant cuts are always in the places where the official version is most confident, most complete, most thoroughly certain that there is nothing there to see. Antarctica is the most thoroughly certain nothing in the modern world. Its emptiness is scientific, its blankness is treaty enforced, its interior is managed by an international agreement that has, for over 60 years, kept ordinary people away from the deepest geography of the continent that sits at the bottom of the world, below the bottom of every map, at the place where the old cartographers kept drawing things that the new cartographers preferred not to acknowledge. A film reel screened once in a quiet room in 1947 is not proof of any of this. It is a thread. It is the kind of thread the Tartaria investigation follows, not because the thread alone is evidence, but because of what it connects to, the early end of the largest Antarctic mission ever launched, the public statements of its commander that did not fit the mission's official purpose, the old maps that show a south that should not have been knowable, and the systematic absence of documentation in exactly the places where documentation would either confirm or end the question. The reel connects to all of it. It connects because it was shot where the mission ended, and because what it showed was enough to put it in a canister, in a hand, in a quiet room, and then in the same silence it has occupied ever since. What the cameraman saw when he pointed his camera at what was not ice has not been stated by anyone who was in that room. The room is gone. The men are gone. The reel, if it survived the decades, is in a location that no public record points toward. But the canister was real, the hand carry was real, the screening was real, and the instruction given at the door of that building, the one that cost a young man 30 years of silence, was real too. The most honest thing that can be said is this: the record ends where the mission stopped making sense, and the footage that would explain the ending is the footage that was never broadcast again. That is either the ordinary shape of a military archive, or it is something else entirely. The longer the silence holds, the harder it becomes to believe in the ordinary shape. Stay with this channel. The next reel is still out there, and the room it was screened in left more than one document behind.